أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد.
So today is actually our second meeting to discuss the Anima of Aristotle. We had a kind of far-ranging discussion over book one the last time we met. And just to quickly recap that, in book one, Aristotle begins by talking about how psychology, the study of the psyche, the Greek word for the soul, ilmun nafs in Arabic, is one of the most noble of pursuits because it is built upon, he makes the claim, demonstrative proof. And the term which Ibn Rushd in his talkhis, or his middle commentary on the Anima, refers to as wathaqatul burhan. And Aristotle also says that, well, it has the most noble subject matter, being the soul. And so Ibn Rushd talks about in his translation, in his middle commentary, sharaful mawdu'. And so it's very clear that Aristotle wants to establish the science of soul on an apodictic or demonstrative basis, and that it is an extremely noble science, and it is extremely noble because knowledge of the soul is fundamental to the human being in all areas of life, apparently. However, then before he gives us an explanation or a definition of what exactly the soul is, he says, it really behooves us to first examine the views of all of those who have come before. And so that makes this whole section, that whole book, to be pretty obscure. He goes through the major pre-Socratic thinkers. There's also the Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, Plato. So there's a lot going on there, and it's hard to say really how accurate Aristotle's accounts of those predecessors, of the thinkers who preceded him, how accurate that account is. And also, given the extremely long period of time that has passed since then, and we got into some of this in the first lecture or seminar, was that, do we really know what these terms mean? When they say that the soul is a fire or it's something else, what does that mean? And I mentioned the works of Cornford, one of the works of Cornford, and a very interesting article also by Sayyid Hussein Nasr about Mullā Ṣadrā's interpretation of Thales and the water of life, and how that was Nafas al-Rahman. So that was pretty much what was of interest there, at least to me. But I don't know that we'll make any further progress on that, unless, of course, anything is possible. But I think it's pretty hard to make get any deeper insights into what those people in the past really had in mind. So in book two, Aristotle finally then begins to tell us what the soul is. And so in today's seminar, I would like to discuss his definition of the soul. And I'm going to be referring to the Anima by Christopher Shields, which is the basic go-to or standard text which we'll be using in these seminars, as well as Averroes' middle commentary on Aristotle's Anima. So if you have those hard copies, please open them up to book two. If you're using PDFs, then you're using PDFs. So Aristotle says, let this much be said about what has been handed down concerning the soul by our predecessors. This is the very beginning of book two, or 412a1. Let us start anew, as if from the beginning, endeavoring to determine what the soul is and what its most common account would be. So Aristotle then begins with substance. He begins with substance. So you have to understand, he is trying to determine, and he mentioned this in book one as well, briefly, that it's a question now of determining which maqula or which category which predicament the soul comes under. Is it a substance or is it one of the 9 accidents? And some of the predecessors put it under the accidents. They said the soul is a quantity. It's like it's a number in motion. It had various ideas. But for Aristotle, soul is under the category of substance. But what kind of substance is it? That's what he's discussing in this opening, in the opening lines of chapter 1 of book 2. We say that among the things that exist, one kind is substance, and that one sort is substance as matter, which is not in its own right some this. Another is shape and form, in accordance with which it is already called some this. And the third is what comes from these. Okay, so this is not a very obvious what he's trying to say. Essentially, what he's saying is that substance is spoken of in 3 ways. So, when Aristotle in his logical treatises, and which are reflected also in his metaphysics, he says that being, or wujud, we would say in Arabic, is said in many ways. And so he's saying here that substance is said or is spoken of, at least in this context, in 3 ways: as matter, as form, and then when he says, and what comes from these, in other words, their combination, the combination of these 2. And it should be pointed out, and he does this, he says, and I quote, this is line 9 from 412a1, matter is potentiality, while form is actuality. And actuality is spoken of in 2 ways. So in turn, actuality goes in 2 ways, right? First as knowledge is, and second as contemplating is. Now that is a lot of verbiage there. It doesn't really read well in English, I think, or it doesn't sound that great in English. There might be other translations in English that you could refer to, but contrast this with how much more clear Averroes or Ibn Rushd is. Let's just quickly read this paragraph. So we had 412a. It doesn't match up exactly. So in the Anima book 2, chapter 1, in Averroes, it actually begins with 412a3.
Which page number is this?
This is in Averroes on page 43, and the Arabic and English have the same page number. So the Arabic says, تلخيص المقالة الثانية من كتاب النفس الحكيم أرسطوطاليس. And he said, we have reported all that has reached us of our predecessors' views on the soul. We have now to take the initiative in this discussion, beginning with a definition of what the soul is, and generally speaking, indicating its most comprehensive definition, one inclusive of every soul. We say that substance is spoken of in 3 ways. One is the substance, which is matter, something found not in actuality, but only in potentiality. The second way is of substance as form, that through which the potential substance becomes actual and a given object. And the third way is of the substance as a combination of these 2, which are the individuals and species of things. Matter is form in potentiality, and form is a perfection of what is in potentiality. Form is twofold: as a first perfection, as with a learned person, when he is not using his knowledge, and as a final perfection, as when he is. In Arabic, it says, قال فهذا هو جملة ما قلناه فيما تأدى إلينا من الآراء في النفس عمن تقدمنا، وقد يجب علينا بعد ذلك أن نأخذ في الكلام فيها، ونبتدئ من ذلك بتعريف ما هي النفس، وبالجملة بتعريف الحد الذي هو أعم الحدود لها، أعني الذي يشمل كل نفس. فنقول إن الجوهر يقال على 3 معان: أحدها على الجوهر الذي هو الهيولة, that's prime matter, وهذا ليس هو شيئا موجودا بالفعل. So, in other words, matter is just a pure potentiality. It isn't there in an actuality. وإنما هو بالقوة. والثاني هو جوهر على طريق الصورة. So it's it's substance qua form. وهو الذي به يكون الجوهر الموجود بالقوة موجودا بالفعل ومشارا إليه، والثالث الجوهر المجتمع منهما وهي الأشخاص والأنواع، والهيولى بالقوة الصورة، والصورة هي استكمال الذي بالقوة، والصورة على ضربين: صورة على كمالها الأول بمنزلة العالم حين لا يستعمل علمه، وصورة على كمالها الأخير بمنزلة العالم حين يستعمل علمه. Very clear, isn't it? Much more clear than what we read. So he's saying that the soul is a substance, but it is substance qua form. Substance conceived of as form, and form is seen as the completion or the perfection of that which is potential in matter. And you can see what is meant by the analogy or the example that is given of someone who is knowledgeable, someone who has knowledge of something. So let's say you have someone who is educated in a nahu, all right? But at the moment, he's not doing any nahu. He's just sitting on a park bench admiring nature. He isn't using his knowledge of grammar. Then all of a sudden, he realizes that, he wants to think about some grammatical question, or somebody, I don't know, comes up to him while he's seated on the park bench and says, أيها النحوي, I don't know, ما هو إعراب أقائم الزيداني, and then he has to do the i'rab of that, and he's using his knowledge. So there, it's in use. So otherwise, it's in potential, and this also leads to certain other questions, and in terms of how the soul then is inseparable from the body. But Ibn Rushd will later comment, in expanding as he does on Aristotle, saying that it doesn't really make sense to ask the question, are the soul and the body one, right? Because we wouldn't say, is the knowledge and is the knower and his knowledge one or not? Are they separate? Can you separate the one from the other? So this is how Aristotle begins his understanding of what is meant by the soul. And he continues on this and then tries to build up to a definition. So if we continue then from the same chapter 1, and now we're still in 412a, but now we're at 412a, line 12. Body, on page 22 of Shield's translation. Bodies seem most of all to be substances, and among these natural bodies, since these are the principles of the others. Among natural bodies, some have life and some do not have it. So I think by principles, again, it's these elements. So I am actually reading this work of Aristotle in the translation of Shield's side by side with the Arabic of Ibn Rushd, because it's really makes it much easier to understand. And I think that Ibn Rushd's commentary is in the long run more useful than whatever Shields has written here. Which is not to say that Shields is useless, but the first time around you can only read so much, right? So I think this is an excellent procedure for the student of the De Anima to read it with a translation like that of Shields. And these translations all have their pluses and minuses unless you know Greek, which I don't, and then to read it with the translation of your choice, in this case Shields, along with Ibn Rushd in Arabic, since everyone here knows Arabic. It continues on line 15. It would follow that every natural body having life is a substance, and a substance as a compound. That is a key point. So Aristotle's account of the soul is intimately tied up with his hylomorphism. the doctrine of hylomorphism, the doctrine of matter and form. That's what is meant by substance as a compound. But since it is also a body of this sort, for it has life, the soul could not be a body. So he's still arguing that the soul is something different from the body itself. For the body is not among those things said of a subject, but rather is spoken of as a subject and as matter. It is necessary then that the soul is a substance as the form of a natural body, which has life in potentiality. So this is one definition, namely that soul, this is line 20, is a substance as the form of a natural body, which has life in potentiality. He continues, but substance is actuality. Hence, the soul will be an actuality of a body of such as sort. Actuality, then he elaborates, he continues, is also spoken of in two ways, ala darbain. First as knowledge is, and second as contemplating is. Evidently, then, sorry. Evidently, then, the soul is actuality as knowledge is. So that example again of al-alim hina yasta'milu ilmahu in the phrasing of Ibn Rushd. But then Aristotle shifts over to sleeping and waking. He says, for both sleeping and waking depend upon the soul's being present. And as waking is analogous to contemplating, sleeping is analogous to having knowledge without exercising it. So he elaborates one example by another example. Al-alim wa ilmuhu, and he elaborates that by the example of an-nawm and an-na'im, the sleeping and the sleeper. And in the same individual knowledge is prior in generation. Then he concludes, hence, the soul is the first actuality of a natural body which has life and potentiality. And this is the definition. And there's a slightly different wording in 412, in 412b, which we're just about to read. But this is exactly the definition. So look at it. The soul is the first actuality of a natural body which has life in potentiality. This is almost the same thing you find in the Arabic texts. So what we have today, the most famous, like Hassan Zada Amali, for example, he says, "An-nafsu kamalun awwalin lijismin tabi'iyyin." Only difference here is that it doesn't have aliyin. Aliyin would mean organic, but organic doesn't mean the sense of living matter. It means having organs. Like when you say organic chemistry now, that's the kind of chemistry that people who go into the life sciences, particularly medicine, have to take, right? Because they deal with organic things. And then organic means all this stuff in the health food industry now. No, here the word ali means having organs. But here he hasn't used that yet. But he does bring it up elsewhere in the text.
يعني جسم العالي?
Yeah, so he says, so it's in Arabic, in like Manzuma, it says an-nafsu kamalun awwalin li jismin tabi'iyyin aliyin, natural organic body, dhi hayatin bil quwwa, which has life and potentiality. So then he continues, he says, this sort of body would be one which is organic. You see, he elaborates in the next sentence. Organic here means, again, i.e., having organs. And even the parts of plants are organs. So I don't know in modern biology if plants and if the stem and the roots are considered as organs or not. I am not familiar with the nomenclature and conventions of modern biology. But Aristotle says, and even the parts of plants are organs, although altogether simple ones. For example, the leaf is the shelter of the outer covering, and the outer covering of the fruit and the roots are analogous to the mouth, since both draw in nourishment. And nourishment is the key thing for the plant. This comes out later as well. So then here's the next definition. Hence, if it is necessary to say something which is common to every soul, it would be that the soul is the first actuality of an organic natural body. So here he refines it, right? There he wanted to just say natural body. Now he brings in the further qaid of ali, or organic, having organs. So this is really the heart of book 2. And the rest of it is a whole argument then about what all of this means. And it's here that he says that, well, it's unnecessary, if you understand this, to speak of whether the soul and the body are one. For this reason, it is also unnecessary to inquire whether the soul and the body are one, just as it is unnecessary to ask this concerning the wax and the shape, nor generally concerning the matter of each thing and that of which it is the matter. For while one and being are spoken of in several ways, what is properly so spoken of is the actuality. You know, he's talking about if you have an impression in wax or something made out of wax. But again, Ibn Rushd is a lot more clear. So if we look at some passages from Ibn Rushd. So for example, he clarifies what Aristotle means by life. So when Aristotle speaks of life, he says, وَأَعْنِي بِقَوْلِنَا حَيَاةٍ مَا لَهُ تَغَذٍ وَنُمُوٍ وَنَقْصٍ وَذَلِكَ بِالذَّاتِ. That doesn't come out so well in what we just read. In other words, and I mean by life, that which has nutrition, growth, and diminution, and that essentially, that is by means of an internal principle. A bimabda'in fihi. So since substance is predicated of natural bodies, and some natural bodies are alive while some others are not, it follows that substance has to be predicated of living bodies. Therefore, every natural living body is a substance because it is composed of matter and form. وإذا كانت الجواهر تقال على الأجسام الطبيعية وكانت الطبيعة منها حياة ومنها غير حياة فيجب أن تكون الجواهر تقال على الأجسام الطبيعية الحية وإن كان كذلك فكل جسم طبيعي حي فهو جوهر وهو جوهر على أنه مركب من مادة وصورة. So in the rest of book 2, he wants to understand what does it mean then to say that something is alive and it has organs. Right? It's just a further elaboration of all of this. So he goes on, as that which has life is a body, which has a certain property, whereby it is said to be a living body, that is to have a soul, it is clear, since the soul is a substance, that it cannot be the substance which is body. Again, we read this in Aristotle. Body is not that which is found in a subject, whereas the soul is, but rather it is the material subject. It follows from this that the soul is substance qua form. ولأن الجسم الذي له حياة هو جسم بصفة ما أعني أنه يقال فيه إنه جسم حي أي ذو نفس فبين إذ كانت النفس جوهرا أنه ليس يمكن أن تكون هي الجوهر الذي هو الجسم وذلك أن الجسم ليس هو من الأشياء التي توجد في موضوع والنفس في موضوع بل هو موضوع هيولى فيجب من ذلك أن تكون النفس هي الجوهر الذي على طريق الصورة. So you always find this الجوهر الذي على طريق الصورة, or in Ibn Rushd, or that the soul is substance qua form. So this hylomorphic doctrine runs throughout Aristotle.
Afwan Ustaz, could we phrase it by saying al-hayula or al-jawhar bima huwa surah?
You could, yeah. He's just saying, I mean, it's just a question of linguistic style at that point. It doesn't change the meaning. And as form is a perfection, and perfection, as we have said, is twofold, first and last. The first being like the existence of knowledge in a wise person when he is not contemplating, the second when he is, and as it is like the existence of knowledge when he is sleeping and when he is awake. And as some natural bodies, those having organs are alive and others without organs are not, it is necessary that the soul be a first perfection of a natural body which has organs. Don't you think this is much clearer?
It is.
It really is. وإذا كانت الصورة استكمالا وكان الاستكمال كما قلنا على ضربين أول وآخر فالأول مثل وجود العلم للعالم حينما لا ينظر والثاني مثل وجوده له في حين ما ينظر ومثل وجود العلم له حين هو نائم ومثل وجوده له حين هو يقظان وكانت الأجسام الطبيعية منها ما هي قابلة للحياة وهي الآلية organic, right, having organs ومنها ما هي غير قابلة للحياة وهي التي ليست بآلية. So I think that's pretty clear. He's talking about all that stuff about sleeping and knowing, which we already looked at. And then he talks about how some natural bodies, those having organs, are alive, and others without organs are not. It is necessary that the soul be a first perfection of a natural body which has organs. Organs are also present in plants, even if hidden, right? So we read this again in Aristotle about how the roots are like the mouth and the stomach, but here he has the stomach, and its leaves are a shield and a protection for the fruit, and these parts are not alike. So this is the most comprehensive definition of the soul there is. So if you go back to Shields, it's a lot of going back and forth, but that would be what, 412b. Yeah, here it says, it has now been said, sorry, it has now been said in general what the soul is. The soul is a substance corresponding to the account, and this is the essence of this sort of body. It is as if some tool were a natural body, e.g. an axe. It's another example. In that case, what it is to be an axe would be its substance, and this would also be its soul. If this were separated, it would no longer be an axe, aside from homonymously. But as things are, it is an axe, for the soul is not the essence and organization of this sort of body, but rather of a certain sort of natural body, one having a source of motion and rest in itself. So the texts don't exactly match up. There's taqdeem and ta'khir and so forth. And that also leads me to wonder about the actual form of Aristotle's original, and what version exactly did Ibn Rushd have access to. Obviously he was reading a translation. What exact version did the translator use? What is the condition of these ancient texts? But there's nothing really radically different or strange. They more or less match up. There's taqdeem, there's ta'khir. Sometimes maybe he drops a thing or two out, but it's more or less the same. So this discourse, back to Ibn Rushd, page 45, has now clarified the fact that the soul is substance qua the perfection, which is the form. For in that, it is the soul by virtue of which the body is what it is. That is, the soul is predicated of the body as quiddity. Now, this is really important because this doesn't come out in the Shields as well. and that which is so predicated is substance, so the soul is a substance. If, for example, any artificial instrument, say an axe, were a natural body, then that thing which is predicated of it as quiddity would be its form and soul. If it should be removed, the axe would remain as an axe only homonymiously. But as an axe is an artificial instrument, this will not occur to it. Indeed, it is possible that the thing by virtue of which is an axe, namely its sharpness, disappears. So if it gets dull, you don't sharpen it, and it remains an axe, but not homonymiously. The relation of the soul, the point that is being made, to a natural body is, though, the kind of relation in which the body has within it a principle of motion and rest. It is therefore necessary that the soul be substance qua form. So the Arabic is فَقَدْ تَبَيَّنَ مِنْ هَذَا الْقَوْلِ أَنَّ النَّفْسَ جَوْهَرٌ عَلَى طَرِيقِ الْإِسْتِكْمَالِ الَّذِي هُوَ الصُّورَةِ وذلك أن النفس لما كان الجسم هو بها ما هو أي هي محمولة عليه من طريق ما هو. So this من طريق ما هو is where the quiddity part comes in. وكان ما يحمل من طريق ما هو جوهرا فالنفس جوهر. ومثال ذلك أنه لو كان آلة من الآلات الصناعية, here آلة means tool, it doesn't mean organ, جسما طبيعيا مثل I think it's قدوم or قدوم is an axe. مثلا لكان الشيء الذي يحمل عليه من طريق ما هو صورته ونفسه لأنه كان يكون إذا رفع على هذا الوجه من القدوم الشيء الذي يحمل عليه من طريق ما هو قدوم لم يبقى قدوما إلا باشتراك الاسم. So اشتراك الاسم is homonymy. فأما من حيث القدوم آلة صناعية فليس يراد ذلك فيه. So he's just making this point that that the soul is predicated of the body as a quiddity. Now, if you go back and compare that here, it's not exactly clear. Here it says in Shields, it has now been said in general what the soul is. The soul is a substance corresponding to the account. And this is the essence of this sort of body. Essence is another word for quiddity in English. It is as if some tool were a natural body, e.g. an axe. In that case, what it is to be an axe would be its substance, and that this would also be its soul. If this were separated, it would no longer be an axe aside from homonymiously. So you see, Ibn Rushd can be of great help in deciphering what is trying to be said here. So just to wrap this up, he now introduces another example. So there's a bunch of examples that have been used here. There's the example of the knower, someone who has knowledge of some subject, and when he's exercising that knowledge actively or not. And then it gives the idea of sleep and wakefulness. Now there's an axe. Now he says, let's assume, let's introduce another example, namely that of one of the organs, which are themselves animated. And so he takes the example of perception and he uses the organ of visual perception, namely the eye. So if we go to that, here it says, gosh, this is 412b line 16, 17, 18. I don't know, I think it's about line 17, maybe. What has been said, it's on page 23. What has been said must also be considered when applied to parts. So parts is confusing, but he clarifies, he says, for if an eye were an animal, its soul would be sight, since this would be the substance of the eye corresponding to the account. It would be the quiddity. You know, but it's which kind of quiddity is it? Remember, we have two kinds of quiddity. And it seems he's saying, fi jawabi ma huwa, but there's some ambiguity here, because right here when he says about the eye and vision, it actually seems to be not quiddity in the sense of fi jawabi ma huwa, but the quiddity in the sense of bima huwa, right? لأن البصر يقوم العين, you know, and ain is not an ain unless it has basira, unless it is basira, excuse me. So if an eye were an animal, its soul would be sight, since this would be the substance of the eye corresponding to the account. The eye is the matter of sight. If sight is lost, it is no longer an eye except homonymous,ly, اشتراك الاسم, in the way that a stone eye or a painted eye is. What has been said in the case of parts must of course be understood as applying to the entire living body, for there is an analogy, as one part is to one part. So by part, he clearly means what Ibn Rushd has in Arabic as al-a'dha, part in the sense of members. For there is an analogy, as one part is to one part, so the whole perceptual faculty is to the whole of the body, which is capable of perception, insofar as it is capable of perception. The body which is cast off its soul is not a being which is potentially such as to be alive. This is rather the one which has a soul. The seed, however, and the fruit is such a body in potentiality. So coming back to the acts, he says, hence cutting and seeing are actualities. In this way, too, is waking an actuality, and a sight and the potentiality of a tool are. In this way, too, is the soul. The body is a being in potentiality, but just as the eye is a pupil and sight, so in this case, too, an animal is the soul and the body. Therefore, that the soul is not separable from the body, or some parts of it naturally has parts, is not unclear. For the actuality of some parts belongs to the parts themselves. Even so, nothing hinders some parts from being separable because of their not being the actualities of a body. So now, in the last part, he gets into another area. He seems to say that there are some a'dha, or some, in this case, it's not really a'dha in the sense of actual physical members as it is faculties. So are there some faculties which are separable from the body? Of course there is, and that's aql. So now let's see how Ibn Rushd deals with this, and then we'll discuss all of this further. He says, in the English translation, conceptualizing the soul with this attribute is rendered clearer by using examples of organs which are themselves animated. The eye, for example, where an animal would have sight as its soul and form, for sight is the eye's substance, through which the eye is what it is. Again, it's substance here. Jawhar. Accordingly, the subject of the faculty of sight would be the matter of this animal, which would be called eye only homonymiously if vision were absent. That is, where that thing whereby it is an eye absent, then necessarily the matter and form of the eye would be absent also. This is the difference between substances and accidents in a subject. So this didn't come out very well there, the contrast between substance and accidents here. When accidents disappear, the subject in which they reside does not. And it does not remain a subject homonymiously. When, however, the substances which are in a subject disappear, then either the subject completely disappears too, or it remains a subject homonymiously. So an axe, if it is no longer sharp, an eye which is rendered ineffective, inoperable, for la qadrallah, whatever reason. So that's why he's saying, so in that example, he's saying the soul is like that, but it's not an accident. It has to be a substance, he's arguing. ولذلك كان تصور النفس بهذه الصفة من مثالات الأعضاء المتنفسة نفسها أوضح. مثال ذلك أن العين لو كانت حيوانا لكان البصر نفسها وصورتها، ولكان هذا هو جوهرها الذي به العين هي ما هي. Right? ولكانت موضوع قوة البصر هي هيولة هذا الحيوان الذي إذا عدم البصر لم يقل عليها عين إلا باشتراك. أعني أنه كان ينعدم منها معنى كونها عينا، فتنعدم لذلك منها مادتها وصورتها ضرورة. وهذا هو الفرق بين الجواهر التي في موضوع والأعراض التي في موضوع. وذلك أن الأعراض إذا ارتفعت لم يرتفع الموضوع الذي هي فيه ولا بقي موضوعا باشتراك الاسم. وأما الجواهر التي هي في موضوع فإنه إما أن يرتفع الموضوع بارتفاعها أصلا وإما أن يبقى موضوعا باشتراك الاسم. I mean, the Arabic of Ibn Rushd is just beautiful. You just love to just keep reading it. So that really concludes the clarification. And now Ibn Rushd chimes in and he basically says, this then is what Aristotle was trying to say. فهذا هو الذي قصده الرسول بهذا المعنى. And then he's just reiterating this whole thing. But if you go down to paragraph 122, he says, فَأَمَّا إِنَّ النَّفْسِ يَظْهَرُ مِنْ أَمْرِهَا مِنْ هَذَا الْحَدِّ. And from this definition, أنها غير مفارقة للبدن. أعني من قبل ما قيل فيها أنها صورة له واستكمال فبين وكذلك الحال في أجزائها. So here he uses the word parts now. He doesn't use أعضاء. So it's more precise than what the English translation is of Shields. I don't know if it's more loyal to the Greek, but it certainly gets the point across much better. إلا أن ذلك إما في أكثر أجزائها فبين وإما في بعضها فغير بين من قبل أنه ليس يمتنع أن يوقف من بعض أجزائها على أن ذلك الجزء ليس استكمالا للبدن على هذا النحو من قبل أنه يوجد لا يستعمل آلة من آلات البدن. So here he doesn't say so, but it's the aql. Out of all of so now these ajza, I don't think I need to read the English translation. These ajza or parts that are being talked about here are not a'dha now. They're not alat. They are faculties of the soul, we would say in English, that might use certain alat, organs. But in the final analysis, there might be some parts, some ajza, some faculties or powers of the soul which are independent. And so now he wants to say, well, is this like, this is the concluding paragraph, is this like the relationship of a sailor to the boat? I don't know if he means sailor. It's more like maybe it's more like the captain. But in Arabic, he actually says al-mallah. Mallah is a word for sailor, in case you didn't know. It's related to the word salt. Because they go out into the. So obviously, a sailor is in Arabic related to the sea, not necessarily to freshwater sailing. Right? So al-mallah. Istikmal as-safina. So he says, ومما يقنع في ذلك أنه يظن أن بعض الاستكمالات مفارقة للأشياء التي يستكمل بها مثل مفارقة الملاح للسفينة ولذلك ما ينبغي أن نبحث عنه هل النفس استكمال البدن بمنزلة ما الملاح بمنزلة ما الملاح استكمال للسفينة أم ليس ذلك كذلك فإن ذلك ليس بين من أول الأمر. So he's basically content with this definition. And now he wants to say, well, let's, to really clarify the matter, we have to see what it means to say that the soul is this completion of an organic, natural body that is potentially alive. So what does it mean to say that something is alive? And this whole question of the powers of the soul is gone into in more detail and really in the rest of the book. But there's a lot which is left unclarified, and so there's a lot of ambiguities that remain in this text. And so in chapter 2 of the De Anima, he wants to subject this definition to a more exacting analysis. So he says that it's not enough that a definition may clear the T-H-A-T of a thing, but it must also contain and make manifest the cause. So now he is looking for a cause. You know, if we want to fully explain something, we have to know its cause. And he gives an example which almost no contemporary reader is going to understand. Ibn Rushd uses the same example, except Ibn Rushd introduces an example which is nowhere to be found in Aristotle. And that's the example of an eclipse. So the passage in question is 2.2. So if you want to say the cause of something, so, okay, he's giving the example of an eclipse that, you know, if you just define an eclipse as follows, that it is the cutting off of the sun's light from the moon. And he says, يقال فيه في الكسوف القمري إنه انقطع ضوء الشمس عن القمر. That does not furnish what is known as the proximate cause, السبب القريب. Therefore, this definition of an eclipse is of the kind that states what it is. It tells that, as Shield says. But it's only the conclusion of a demonstration, and we aren't given the demonstration. In other words, we have no idea about the cause. When, though, one adds the datum that the earth is between the moon and the sun, then knowledge of the eclipse is completed and the definition achieves perfection. ولذلك كان هذا الحد الكسوفي من جنس ما هو نتيجة برهان. وأما إذا زيد في هذا الحد لقيام الأرض بينه وبين الشمس فقد تمت المعرفة بالكسوف وحصل حده على التمام الذي لم يبقى بعد في الكسوف تشوق إلى معرفة شيء من أمره. That is nowhere to be found in Aristotle. But it's a decent enough example. If you just say, well, a lunar eclipse is the cutting off of the light of the reflected light of the sun's reflected light from the moon, then you're like, well, okay, but why? Well, it's because the earth comes in between, casts a shadow, etc., etc. So Aristotle does not have that example, and maybe Ibn Rushd introduced that because that's a more accessible example, because Aristotle gives an extremely mathematical one, and this mathematical example is actually a reference to Euclid, book 2, proposition 14. In the Green Lion Press edition, proposition 14 is on pages 49 to 50. Now, if you go there and read that, it will not help you very much. So that's the major thing he's referring to. But then there's another portion in Euclid, and that is Euclid book 6. Book 6. Which proposition in book 6? Proposition 13. Now, Shields, in his own commentary.
What are the page
Yes?
numbers? Sorry, Afwan, forgive me. So the page numbers for book 6, prop 13.
One moment.
Forgive me.
No, it's my fault. I didn't say the page number. Proposition 13, book 6, proposition 13. And that's 134, page 134. It's just on that one page. So book 6, proposition 13 has to do with two given straight lines used to find what's called a mean proportional. And in book 2, prop 14, that's more directly what's in question. Book 2, 14. Wrong book. Is to construct a square equal to a given rectilineal figure. And it actually need not be a rectangle. Right? So Shields, in his own commentary on this, is not much of a help, actually. I'll tell you why. So his Shields' explanation of this is on page 182. And he just gives these diagrams which are lifted from Euclid without really explaining them. All right, so now we've given out, we've been rigorous from a scholarly point of view and given all the references, but what is Aristotle trying to say? He's saying, look, if we want to give a definition of the soul, and the way we've defined it, we really haven't given the cause of the soul. And that's like saying that, giving the explanation of squaring. And the modern way to say this would be that, let's say you've got a rectangle. So a rectangle has a length and width. And you want to construct a square that has the same area. So if you have some rectangle, it's of some length and some width, its area will be L times W, length times width. And you want to construct a square of side S such that S squared, which is the area of the square, equals LW. That's all. Now, so if you say that that is what squaring means, you've given a definition, but you haven't given the reason or the cause, presumably why it works. And so the ancient Greeks would solve what we considered an algebraic problem geometrically through constructions. And it's too involved to go into here, and it's pretty tedious. If you want to go and read it in Euclid, you can. But what it amounts to is constructing a mean proportional. So if you have a rectangle of length L and width W, what you do is you just draw that out as one line, LW, L plus W, okay? And you want to say that L is to the side of some square as the side of that square is to W. In other words, A over S equals S over B, or sorry, L over S equals S over W. You cross multiply and you get S squared equals LW. That's all he's saying. But that form, in other words, L over S equals S over W, that shows that S is what is called the mean proportional between L and W. And that's why it works. Okay, so that's a pretty involved example for most average people today. And he also, Shields also says that this is also an allusion to what he has said in the Metaphysics. I just lost the page. Let me get you the reference. So if you go to Metaphysics of Aristotle, Metaphysics 996b14, I actually had this marked before class, and I just pulled out the bookmark by accident. 996b14. Yeah, here in this translation, this is the translation by Richard Hope, Aristotle's Metaphysics. This is Metaphysics book Beta, and it's on page 43 of this translation, but it's 996b14. He says the science of primary being, inasmuch as it treats by definition of first factors and of what is the most intelligible, would be wisdom. For in view of the many ways in which men may know the same thing, we say that he knows. Better who knows well something in particular, instead of merely being able to distinguish it from other things. So being able to distinguish one thing from another thing is to give its definition, right? And that such positive knowledge is always better than the negative, but we say that he knows best of all who knows what something, rather than how much it is or what it resembles or what it can do. And it goes on and on. In other words, it's just making the point that to know the cause of a thing is much better than simply knowing its definition. And of course, metaphysics is what? Metaphysics is first philosophy, but metaphysics is also concerned with arriving at al-asbab al-quswa lil-ashya, the ultimate cause of things. Of course, the ultimate cause is Allah, and there's any number of other proximate causes in between. So the full knowledge and full account of a thing is to also account for its existence through some cause. So now, how do we do that with soul? That's now what is happening in chapter 2 of book 2. So you see, this is a really sophisticated work. It's not and it's not an easy book by any stretch of the imagination. So now let's jump back into the De Anima, chapter 2. So he gives that example then of squaring, which doesn't really help us, but I've done my best to explain what is meant. So he continues. Now this is line 21 from chapter 2, 413a 21. We say then, taking up the beginning of the inquiry, that what is ensouled is distinguished from that which is not ensouled by living. So he's trying to explain what is the hayatin part, bil quwwa. But living is spoken of in several ways. So again, what does it mean for a thing to be alive? And so this is where he introduces the notion of, well, plants are alive, animals are alive, human beings are alive, but they all exhibit a different degree or a different kind of life. So living is spoken of in several ways, and should even one of these belong to something, we say that it is alive. And what are these things? Reason, perception, motion, and rest with respect to place, and further the motion in relation to nourishment, decay, and growth. So I think it's interesting to see how Ibn Rushd mentions those things. He says, وَإِذَا, this is page 48 of both the English and Arabic. وَإِذَا تَقَرَّرَ هَذَا فَنَرْجِعُ فَنَقُولُ إِنَّ الْمُتَنَفِّسَ يتميز عن غير المتنفس بأنه يقال فيه إنه حي. ولما كان هذا يقال في شيء من قبل معان, in different ways, فبين أن كل ما وجد فيه معنى من تلك المعاني فهو يوصف بالحياة. مثال ذلك العقل والحس والحركة في المكان والتغذي, والذبول, I think, or والذبول, not sure of the vowing of that, والنمو. So the word is decay. فإن كل موجود فيه معنى من هذه المعاني ينطلق عليه اسم الحياة. ولذلك قيل في النبات إنه حي وإن لم يوجد فيه إلا مبدأ التغذي والنمو. So the plant only has nutrition and growth. والنقص, and of course decay, diminution. وإنما كان ذلك كذلك لأنه يوجد فيه قوة ومبدأ يفعل النمو أو يفعل النمو والنقص في الجهات المتضادة من الشيء. So it has a faculty and a principle, he says here in the English, which induces from it growth and decay in opposite directions. Okay, so now it's clarified that, for something to be alive, it's got to have one of these things.
And these are things.
Intellect, sensation, locomotion, nutrition, decay, and growth. Yes?
Yes, so these are essential things for something to have life. These are not accidental.
Yeah, it's got to be there. But he doesn't say that all of them. So now, what he's going to say in the rest of the treatise really is he looks at how far that these things go. So it's clear that the bare minimum is nutrition and growth, which is what we find in plants. But plants don't really have locomotion min makanin ila makanin akhar. They might pivot, but they're rooted to the ground because they're plants. The flowers may open, the leaves may, they may fall, they may move with the movement of the sun. That is there, but they don't have what we call locomotion. So then the bare minimum there for life then is nutrition and growth. So clearly all living things have to derive some nourishment from the environment. They need food, they need water, and their food and water may be different for different creatures, but that's the bare minimum. And then what rises up then to the level of animal is sensation. And the fundament and the most basic, then there's different kinds of sensation, he's going to say. And so then what's the lowest threshold for sensation out of those senses? He says it's touch.
He says it's touch.
Yeah.
It's interesting because in metaphysics, doesn't he say that it's sight?
No, he says something else about sight there. He says, I think he does. Let's check. I've got the metaphysics right here. He says all men naturally have an impulse to know or to get knowledge. A sign of this is the way we prize our senses, for even apart from their utility, they are prized on their own account, especially sensing with the eyes. For not only from practical motives, but also when we have nothing practical in view, we could be said to prefer sight to any of the other senses. The reason is, this is maybe what you have in mind, that of all the senses, it can best bring us knowledge and best discerns the many differences among things. Yeah, so it best brings us knowledge. It's the highest of the senses, but he's saying the bare minimum for sensation is touch, right? He doesn't even say taste. The bare minimum is sensation.
Right, touch. Yeah, I understand.
And so if you want to use the example of sight, let's say, la qadar Allah, someone who is deprived of their vision. It's true that they use sound and so forth, but they basically feel their self around, right? They do use the hearing and I suppose the smell. Taste is not going to help you in getting around. That's just for eating. And so they will have an extension of their senses, like many people use a cane.
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
Or they use what do you call them? A dog, seeing eye dog. And so the dog acts niyabatan on the person, but the person then just follows where the dog is pulling again. It's a sensation. So I think that's why Aristotle was saying that sensation then is the low threshold. And then what never really gets explained anywhere, and you'll see this later in book 3 and so forth, is really what's going on with the intellect. And so I'm going to stop reading from this. I think we've made our point, but we've made enough points, I think. And I think I've given you the key to how you can read this work on your own. Basically, what I do is I read what's there in some translation. Again, I'm using Christopher Shields' translation of the De Anima, and I read a passage, and then I go and read a passage, or I'll read a whole book from there or a chapter, and then I'll go and read the whole thing in Ibn Rushd, and it becomes much clearer. Now, since we are talking a little bit about Ibn Rushd's long commentary on the De Anima is really worth having. Oh, you got
This one?
Yeah, brilliant. So this contains his mature views, and according to Professor Taylor, Richard C. Taylor, who we're blessed to have him have taken upon himself the onerous task of preparing this text. The long commentary represents the final and mature views of Ibn Rushd. And there is a lot of interconnection between the middle commentary. Modern people would say intertextuality. That's fine if you just mean that in the linguistic sense of the term. So the middle commentary and the long commentary are very closely related, and they refer to each other. But it's really in the long commentary that he sets out his most profound views. And then in the short commentary, I don't have a copy of that. Anyhow.
Sorry, Dr. Nizam, don't mean to interrupt, but is this the work which was compiled by Richard Taylor, the long commentary, his edition? Is it simply the translation, or does it have the original Arabic text alongside?
Okay, that's a very good question. I explained in the first lecture, because I mentioned this book in the first lecture, but I was going to emphasize it again anyhow, and it's good you brought it up. The long commentary of Ibn Rushd does not survive in Arabic.
Okay.
It only survives, there are fragments and quotations, I think maybe in other works, is what I understood from Taylor's introduction. It only survives in its entirety in two other languages, Latin and Hebrew.
Okay.
And according to Taylor, the Hebrew one is really good. So what did Taylor do? Taylor took the Latin and he took the Hebrew, and he took whatever fragments of the Arabic he could find, and he had the middle commentary, and he has the shorter commentary, and he has the original text of Aristotle in Greek, and a bunch of other translations of Aristotle, and he produced this really important book. So when Aristotle continues this inquiry and tries to examine what does it really mean then for these different powers and faculties of the soul, the one which he never really properly explains is intellect. And that's the one where he leaves the door open for it being able to survive independent of the body. And that's what's very important. I'm not sure how Aquinas deals with it, but I have Aquinas's commentary on the De Anima as well. So I would look at that. I mean, this is why this is a seminar. My own understanding of this work is something which I'm still working on. Trying to read all of these different commentaries and try to understand exactly what happened. And of course, the subject has its own interest, but and I have that interest. But one of my main goals in reading all of this is really trying to understand what happened in the Muslim world, with historically, chronologically in order with Avicenna, but then finally with Mullā Ṣadrā, because all of the guys who write on this today, and there's not that many in the Hawza, right? It's Hassan Zada Amali, right? He wrote that book. But people who are involved in Hawza studies or people who read Mullā Ṣadrā, this is the definition we're left with. And so Ibn Rushd basically devoted a big part of his scholarly time and research into solving this problem of the intellect. And that is what you actually find is the major commentarial goal in the long commentary. There's the major goal of the long commentary is to explain what exactly is meant by the active intellect. So Aristotle introduces this concept of the active intellect, or al-aqlul fa'al in Arabic, but in Greek it is called the nous poetikos.
Nous poeticus.
So the question that one is trying to solve here is, how is it possible for the human soul to grasp abstract things that do not have any physical form, but even things that do have a physical form, from which you make an abstract image in your mind? So by way of example, you may have been to the British Museum and you have seen the Rosetta Stone. But I don't have the Rosetta Stone in front of me, but I have an image of it in my mind. So how is this kind of knowledge possible? And then there is a kind of knowledge in which, and it's sort of like it's as if the idea, without the whole elaborate theory, is there, of the unification of knower and the known, or the unification of the intelligible and the intellect, what later in Mullā Ṣadrā is called ittihad al-aql bil-ma'qul. So how are these intelligible things united with the person? And there is a kind of unification that takes place with those intelligibles. I mean, there are certain things which I know so well that they are a part of me. And I'm sure that you can think of that in your own situation. There might be certain subject matters in which you are, mashallah, very mutamakkin, very, very well established. And you really say, well, that it is part of me. You become the thing. And it's even a level beyond what in Arabic is called al-aql bil-malaka, in the sense that, it becomes like a skill. And if it's a physical thing, it becomes a muscle memory. You've done it so many times. You've done this motion with a tennis racket, or with a sword, or with drawing your pistol and firing it and reloading it, whatever, these kind of things which people train in, whether athletes or elite professional soldiers or martial artists or what have you, what is called the phenomenon of muscle memory, right? It becomes a part of you. But this is something on an even other level. So how is that possible, and what is the explanation for that? So this notion of what is called conjunction with the active intellect, al-ittisal bil-aql al-fa'al. This is what Ibn Rushd was really interested in as a philosophical problem in the study of the de anima. I'm not saying that this was the whole goal of his life. He did many other things. He was a mufti. He has a book, Bidayatul Mujtahid. Have you heard of this book? That is a good book. He was a physician. But I think that this question was really important to him. And the reason is, he met Muhyiddin ibn Arabi. And it's a famous meeting which Ibn Arabi talks about in the Futuhat himself. And Ibn Arabi was a much younger, a very young man. Ibn Rushd, I think, had heard about his fath, his opening, and he wanted to meet him. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it was Ibn Arabi's father, because they were a well-to-do family. They were involved with the ruling dynasty. So anyhow, somehow a meeting is arranged. And Ibn Rushd is asking him, is what you find in Sufism? He doesn't spell it out in so many words, but this is the background to the meeting. That, is what is achieved in Sufism, is it really the same as what the philosophers say? And when he speaks of the philosophers, he means this conjunction. Al-ittihad bil aql not ittihad, excuse me, ittisal. The ittisal, the conjunction or connection with the active intellect. And Ibn Arabi at first says yes, and then he says no, and it's a famous story. And then Ibn Rushd becomes very concerned, because Ibn Arabi says between the yes and the no, he says something like the heads fly off of the necks. He makes some statement of this kind, and I'm not really sure what he means. But Ibn Rushd was really shaken, and he turned white apparently, and he uttered the hawqala, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, and that was kind of the meaning. It's really famous. It's mentioned in almost every Ibn Arabi biography and so on. So this is really the big question, at least what became the big question in the Muslim world. And then after that, it's not really clear what happened, because I don't want to give you the wrong idea. So please understand, Avicenna, as far as I know, never read Ibn Rushd. You know, Ibn Rushd is in some ways a kind of his life is a kind of his intellectual production has this quality of you know, not really having been treated fairly by history or what have you. You know, it's kind of there's an odd kind of, I would say, mazlumiyat in Ibn Rushd's Turath, because for whatever reason it didn't really circulate in the Islamic world. It circulated in Europe. Maybe it was closer. It didn't really get a readership in the heartlands of the Muslim world, the Eastern lands, until modern times. That's odd, you know, that's really through Orientalists that Muslims, and it's strange because in the 19th century, then everyone suddenly becomes interested in Ibn Rushd and ascribes all kinds of things to him and so forth. But it's only really now that people are revisiting Ibn Rushd in a serious way. I mean, look, this book, the Middle Commentary, came out in 2002. At least this edition. I think it came out before in Arabic only in Cairo. And this long commentary, when does this get published? Let's see. This is 2009. 2009. You know, people are very interested in Tahafut. That's been around for quite a while. They were interested in his legal writings, but Ibn Rushd, the philosopher, whatever you may think about his ideas, that's another matter, but he hasn't really gotten a proper reading in the Islamic world till modern terms. And I'm not even sure if people care about him in Iran.
I was just going to say, if you look at the philosophy of Mullā Ṣadrā by Fazl ar-Rahman,
yeah,
I'm looking for the footnote where it is cited, and he really takes Sayyid Jalaluddin Ashtiani to task, and more or less implies that he's a racist bigot.
1 second, what come here. Can you just excuse me for a minute? I'm just going to mute my mic for a second.
Sure.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, he basically, it's at the beginning, and he basically calls him a racist. Yes, he does.
Yeah, footnote 27.
Oh, you found it. Okay.
Yeah, on page 22. Sayyid Jalaluddin Ashtiani also states, no nation in the world possesses as much capacity of philosophic and particularly theosophic thought as do Persians. In the Muslim world, it is the Persians who laid the foundations of philosophical schools or methods. And he goes on, where Ibn Rushd, although he had a philosophic capacity, is nevertheless dismissed as highly superficial and pedestrian, and a certain anti-Arab sentiment. Cultivation and encouragement of this kind of attitude is unlikely to lead to either serious scholarship or creative thought. So
yeah, this is a famous footnote. I remember reading this back in the day.
Yeah. When I first read it, I was shocked and taken aback as well. And I found it, and I have the hard copy of the Shawahid al-Rububiyyah, but not with me, unfortunately.
Yeah, what page of it? Where is that in the Shawahid? Intro to the Shawahid, huh?
Yeah, I have. The only thing I have the Shawahid is the
I don't
English.
have that edition. Okay, I'll look for it. Yeah,
I have the actual 1967 Mashhad University Press edition, but not with me physically. The only thing I have physically with me is the English preface by Sayyid Nasser.
Footnote. It's Shawahid, right? So footnote 47.
Let me see. see note 47 below. And
I'm not sure
Yeah.
what 47 refers to. Okay, you know, it's not a big. Let's search that and bring that up next time.
sure. Yeah. But yeah, to answer
So-
your question, he's not taken seriously in Iran, to be honest with you. Not that
Yeah,
I know of.
that's a
or heard of.
shame.
Yeah, it is.
That's a shame because, you know, like I said, whatever you might think of Ibn Rushd, well, at least read him first. You can't just dismiss him like that. And I'm really amazed at how a lot of Iranians are so interested in any Gora or French or some German or whatever, and they write these things. It's, you know, there was a guy. There's, you know, Abul Qasim Kakai. Have you heard of him?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
I met him in 2003. I never was in touch with him after that. But I have a student who lives in Shiraz. And Kakai lives in Shiraz and teaches there. And so he told me that he once met up with Kakai just to pay his respects. And Kakai told him that he was lecturing to some students that day in the Danishgah, whatever, you know. And he teaches in, I think, in Ilahiyat faculty. And he was just lecturing, and then he says, you know, that I think he just made up a name. I don't remember what name was. I think, let's just say Mr. Brown. And so he says that, you know, Aghay Brown Farmudand and what, and he just made up a bunch of nonsense and they all wrote it down. And then he said, you know, what is wrong with you people? I just completely made this up. So you'll just write down anything that, you know, like some white person, right? So that's the way they are. And they're interested in all of these, you know, stupid theories and so forth, that have come out in the modern world, but they don't want to read a serious guy like Ibn Rushd. And Ibn Rushd is a serious guy. You can't dismiss him. You can disagree. You're welcome to disagree, but then you have to do the man the respect of actually reading what he said. And he's very prolific. He's written a lot. I mean, I find his juristic writings to be extremely useful. He's one of the clearest writers in Arabic I have ever read. And he's a joy and a pleasure to read. Anyway, yeah. I could go on and on.
No, you're absolutely correct. I enjoy him for two reasons. One of which, I believe he needs to be revived again, specifically amongst the Amma, who are basically writing the coattails of Ghazali. And secondly,
the Amma, you mean the Sunnis? Okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah, the so-called Sunnites. And then the second reason is because I have not seen yet such a beautiful case for hikmah to be
in Fasl al-Maqal.
Yeah, his Fasl al-Maqal is
that's
perhaps
a beautiful book.
Treatise. Yeah, it's the best treatise I've read on the subject matter. Yeah,
and it's also in beautiful Arabic. Yeah. Okay, so on that note, I think maybe we can wrap it up. I've got maybe 5 more minutes. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
I had one quick question. We know that obviously Ibn Sīnā was before Ibn Rushd. We see here, I remember in the Anima book 2, we had read that Aristotle just quite explicitly stated soul is not the body. Where is it? It's 412, no, 4 15, 16, 17, 417, book 2. The soul could not be a body. Is this and then he goes on to explain, not in detail, but more or less why. Is this a precursor to could this be a precursor to Ibn Sīnā's Insan al-Mu'allaqa?
It could be, yeah, because that so-called flying man, that's what really shows that there is something in the intellect which is completely, you know, whether it's the soul, the intellect, again, it's the faculty. So if you cut off everything, by which I mean if you cut off all sensory inputs, all the sensoria, then you still have something. So that, yes, that's the soul, but it's the soul right now. Even when we have all our sensory inputs, it's again the soul. But if you cut off all the sensory inputs, then what is left? You have some sort of other faculty, and I would say that is the aql. And that's the thing that can really survive. So through the course of a human life, Aristotle doesn't say this explicitly, but it seems to me that the people who came later, people like Mullā Ṣadrā, have sort of teased this out. Although we don't have any evidence that I know of that Mullā Ṣadrā actually read some translation of the Anima. I don't know that maybe there's such evidence. I don't think there is. But it's clear that you have this thing called the soul. It's the first perfection of the body. And it uses all of these senses. It has to have them to do what it does. All right? So it gives a lot of credence to this idea that at the beginning of a human life, the soul is an actuality, but at the same time, it is a potentiality as well. It's the actuality in the sense that we've just discussed in book 2. But it's also potentiality in so many other ways because it's got all these senses. Well, there's any number of things you can look at. There's any number of things you can hear, you can smell, you can taste, you can eat, you can whatever in the course of a human life. But those sense impressions, then they leave an effect on the person, right, over time. And so again, it's the idea that there are certain potentialities then that are there in the human being. They use the senses to actualize those potentialities. And then at the end of it, what you're left with, if you've done it right when you die, the soul becomes a pure actuality. So when it's the actualization of life, it's the first actuality. But then there's the final actuality. I would say that there are other actualities. And that's what survives after the person dies. Wallahu alam, I don't know. Anyway.
Thank you.
So we can just continue.
I'm going to send you something else. Yes, I'm going to send you something. It's new. It's brand new.
Okay.
It's published, I think like maybe 2 years ago. I have the PDF of it because I myself PDF'd it. I purchased it and I PDF'd it. It's the mulhaq of Kitab of Nihayat al-Hikmah, Kitab al-Nafs, by Sayyid Yadallah Yazdan Panah and Sayyid Ali Amini Najad. I myself have not looked at it yet, but I'll send it to you, and it would be really interesting to see this development in neo-Sadrian philosophy.
Love to see it. Yeah, very good.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's just we can just continue reading on in the book and just keep discussing it. I found this discussion to be useful. But now I think you get the idea. So next time we don't have to read such long passages. But I think the way to go about it, like I did today, is to do these together.
Yes.
By doing together, I mean to read them side by side, like as I explained. And that's what I'm doing, and I'm making my notes and so forth. And I think that's probably the most instructive way of going about it. Okay, very well then. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jazakallah khair.
We'll see you next week, inshallah. Next week I will be traveling, but we're going to do the class. I'll be in New Mexico, but we'll meet up, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Okay, excellent.
Thank you.
All right, Dr. Nizam,
thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sayyid.
Sayyid, if you can post the mulhaq that you mentioned in the group, the PDF.
Yeah, okay. I'll send
that would be excellent. Thank you so
Telegram
much.
group. Yeah, great. Okay, so I'm going to end the recording now, and then I'll post it on the Telegram. Very well. Fi amanillah.
Fi amanillah. Assalamu alaikum.